Ancient superpowers fell in a single lifetime, leaving behind only whispers and ruins. This video investigates the unidentified invaders who destroyed the superpowers of the ancient world, a mystery that rewrites the story of civilization's end. By the close, you will see our own interconnected world in a startling new light, understanding the hidden vulnerabilities that can topple any age. We will confront shadowy armies emerging from the sea and ask if they were ruthless conquerors or desperate refugees. What force could make mighty empires simply vanish from history? The answers lie in a perfect storm of disaster that feels eerily familiar. What do you believe is the greatest threat to a civilization at its peak? Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the world was already connected. From the sun-baked plains of Egypt to the rugged coasts of Greece and the highlands of Anatolia, a web of diplomacy and trade linked mighty kingdoms. It was a globalized system, an ancient version of our own, where royal courts exchanged letters written on clay tablets, ships carried copper from Cyprus and tin from distant lands to forge bronze, and ambassadors traveled with gifts to secure alliances. This was the Late Bronze Age, a glittering cosmopolitan era that had lasted for centuries. At its heart were four pillars of power. To the north, the Hittite Empire, masters of iron and intricate legal treaties, controlled the lands of modern-day Turkey. To the south, the new Kingdom of Egypt stood as the ultimate symbol of wealth and divine order, its granaries full and its monuments eternal, ruled at this crucial moment by the pharaoh Ramesses III. Across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks built grand palaces like Mycenae and Pylos, their warriors celebrated in epic poetry and their merchants trading far and wide. And dotting the eastern Mediterranean coast were the prosperous city-states of the Levant and Cyprus, hubs of craftsmanship and commerce like Ugarit and Nkomi. They communicated in a shared diplomatic language, celebrated similar gods, and followed rules of engagement that maintained a fragile peace. We even have their mail, the Amarna letters, revealing a world where kings addressed each other as brother and negotiated over shipments of gold and glass. It seemed stable, almost permanent, but this glittering world was balancing on a knife's edge. Decades of gradual climate change were beginning to strain harvests. Populations had grown, demanding more from the land. Social hierarchies within these kingdoms grew rigid, creating friction between the palace elites and everyone else. The entire system, for all its sophistication, had become brittle, interconnected in a way that meant a shock in one region could ripple catastrophically through all the others. The stage was set not for a simple war, but for a total systemic collapse. Then the first cracks appeared, and the dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Within the span of a single human lifetime, roughly between 1220 and 1150 before the Common Era, the entire interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age unraveled. It was a rolling wave of catastrophe, a cascade of failures where the collapse of one kingdom pulled the next one down. The first great pillar to shudder was the Hittite Empire. Their magnificent capital, Hattusa, a city of grand temples and fortified walls high in the Anatolian plateau, did not fall to a long siege. It was consumed by a great fire and then deliberately abandoned. The Hittite royal line vanished, their intricate legal codes and diplomatic archives buried under ash and forgotten for over 3,000 years. This was not a conquest, it was an erasure. The shockwave rippled westward across the Aegean Sea. In Greece, the fortified palaces of the Mycenaean world met a similar fate. At Pylos, archaeologists found tablets baked hard by the flames that destroyed the palace, their last messages detailing urgent military preparations for a threat coming from the sea. At Mycenae itself, the mighty Lion Gate stood guard over ruins that would never be rebuilt. The complex bureaucracy, the writing system, the trade networks, all of it simply stopped. On the coast of modern-day Syria, the wealthy merchant city of Ugarit became a tragic symbol of this breakdown. Excavations revealed a clay tablet, the last letter ever sent from its king. It is a desperate plea for help, addressed to the neighboring king of Alashiya, Cyprus. The king writes that the enemy's ships are already here, that his own troops and chariots are deployed far away, and that the city is defenseless. He begs his ally to send forces. We know the reply never came because the letter was found still in its kiln, baked by the very fire that destroyed Ugarit. The entire system of mutual defense had shattered. Only one of the great powers managed to hold the line, but just barely. In Egypt, the pharaohs Merneptah and later Ramesses III faced what their inscriptions call a fight for the very existence of the kingdom. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, Ramesses's memorial temple, show epic naval and land battles against a collective enemy they called the Sea Peoples. He claims great victory, saving Egypt from invasion. But the subtext is clear. Egypt survived, but it was a battered, diminished version of its former self. It retreated in on itself, its wealth and global influence gone. The victory monuments are the boastful cries of a civilization that knew it had just stared into the abyss. This timeline, read through ash layers and fragmented tablets, tells a consistent story. This was not a slow decline. It was a fast-moving systemic failure. A kingdom would fall, its trade would cease, its refugees would flee, putting pressure on the next region, whose own weakened state made it vulnerable to the next shock. Within a few decades, the glittering map of the late Bronze Age was wiped clean, plunging the region into a centuries-long period we now call the Greek Dark Ages, where writing disappeared and life retreated to simple villages. The collapse was complete, but this timeline only tells us what happened, not who was responsible. To find them, we must look to the sea. For centuries, historians pointed to the earth itself as the prime suspect. The ground beneath these ancient capitals did not just hold them up, it could also shake them apart. At site after site, from Mycenaean palaces to Hittite fortresses, archaeologists uncovered layers of collapsed walls, stones flung as if by a giant's hand, and skeletons crushed beneath falling masonry. The evidence seemed clear: a series of devastating earthquakes, perhaps even an earthquake storm rippling along fault lines, could have shattered the physical and psychological backbone of these kingdoms in one terrible decade. It is a compelling image, the gods themselves striking down the proud. Yet while quakes undoubtedly occurred, they feel insufficient. Earthquakes are local tragedies. They do not explain why trade routes from Greece to Egypt evaporated simultaneously, or why writing systems and political structures from different continents all disappeared within a single generation. A quake might topple a palace, but it does not erase an idea. A far more insidious and widespread threat was emerging from the sky, not with violence but with silence. The rain stopped. Tree ring studies, a science called dendrochronology, tell a story of prolonged and severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean, beginning around 1250 before the Common Era. The narrow, tight rings in ancient timber speak of year after year of stunted growth. Sediment cores from lakes and the seafloor paint the same picture, a shift to a drier, colder climate period that scholars now call the 3.2 Kiloyear Event. Imagine the slow, creeping crisis this created. Harvests failed not once but repeatedly. The grain stores in those massive palace bureaucracies, the very source of their power and wealth, began to empty. Famine would have walked the land, a quiet, relentless invader that no army could defeat. This environmental stressor alone could have pushed these complex societies to the brink, triggering desperate migrations and fueling internal unrest. And that unrest points to a third, deeply human factor, the possibility that these empires were hollowed out from within. They were spectacularly top-heavy. All wealth, all decision-making, all surplus grain flowed to the central palace, supporting a small elite of nobles, priests, and scribes. The vast majority of people, the farmers, artisans, and soldiers, lived on the edge. When drought struck and the palace's grain allocations dwindled, the social contract shattered. Why remain loyal to a king or a god who could no longer feed you? Archaeologists see signs of this internal fracture. In some final destruction layers, it is not just the grand throne rooms that were burned, but also the storage complexes and administrative offices, the very symbols of centralized control. This suggests popular uprisings, a revolt against the system itself by those it had failed. Furthermore, the entire globalized economy of the Bronze Age was a delicate web. It relied on a steady flow of tin from Afghanistan and Cornwall to mix with Cypriot copper to make bronze, the essential material for tools and weapons. Disrupt that flow at any point through war, piracy, or drought-stricken supply routes, and the entire technological foundation of these kingdoms grinds to a halt. Their success had made them profoundly fragile, interdependent in a way that magnified any single crisis into a universal catastrophe. So we are left with a perfect storm, a convergence of disasters. Tectonic shifts, climatic change, and social strain all conspired to weaken the great powers. This multi-causal explanation is powerful, and for many scholars it is almost enough. It paints a tragedy of circumstance where civilizations became victims of their own complexity and a changing world. Yet, a nagging question remains. If this was purely a story of environmental and internal collapse, why do the records from the one surviving power, Egypt, speak so vividly and fearfully of new external enemies? Why do the last messages from burning cities warn of ships and strangers, not just of empty granaries and crumbling walls? The evidence on the ground suggests these societies were already sick, their foundations cracking. But the final blow, the event that turned a crisis into a cataclysm, appears to have come from the sea. Into this storm of failing harvests and cracking palaces sailed a new and terrifying force. Our clearest window into their arrival comes not from the ruins of the fallen, but from the boasts of the sole survivor. On the sun-baked stone walls of Pharaoh Ramesses III's memorial temple at Medinet Habu in Egypt, a story of apocalyptic conflict is carved in breathtaking detail. The reliefs show a chaotic naval battle, Egyptian warships with archers firing from their decks grappling with strange, sleek vessels. The enemy warriors are depicted with a striking and consistent feature, tall, feathered headdresses that seem to sway in the chaos of battle. These are not the traditional foes of Egypt like the Libyans or the Nubians. The hieroglyphic captions give them a collective and ominous title, the Sea Peoples. The story begins a generation earlier. On the great Karnak inscription, Pharaoh Merneptah, Ramesses' predecessor, records repelling an alliance of Libyans and northern invaders he calls the Sea Peoples in a land battle. He lists names among them, the Shekelesh, the Lukka, the Ekwesh. This is our first historical mention of these groups, a fleeting glimpse of a gathering threat. But it is Ramesses III, facing a much larger invasion decades later, who provides the epic narrative. His inscriptions describe a world in flames. He declares the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. The list of kingdoms that had fallen reads like a eulogy for the Bronze Age: Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia, each one cut off. The text paints a picture of a coordinated migratory force, a confederation of different peoples moving by land and sea with their families and possessions, not just an army but an entire population on the move. The names Ramesses records are enigmatic and musical, a roster of mystery. The Peliset, who would later settle on the coast of Canaan and become the Philistines of biblical fame. The Tjeka, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, and the Weshesh. These are not Egyptian names, they are attempts to capture the sounds of what these people called themselves. And this is a crucial detail. The Egyptians described them as a coalition of distinct groups, a confederation from the islands in the midst of the sea and the distant northern lands. They were not a single homogeneous race or a rogue kingdom, but a collection of different societies, perhaps displaced by the same droughts and earthquakes that had weakened the great empires, now banding together in a desperate search for new homes. The Medinet Habu reliefs show their ox-drawn carts loaded with belongings, a poignant detail that suggests migration as much as invasion. Yet we must read these sources with caution. They are victory monuments, state propaganda designed for eternity to glorify the pharaoh as the defender of cosmic order against chaos. In this story, Ramesses is the flawless hero, and the sea peoples are the faceless agents of that chaos. The inscriptions tell us nothing of their origins, their language, or their motivations beyond conquest. They are the ultimate other, defined only by their threat to Egypt. This leaves us with a profound puzzle. We have a vivid, terrifying portrait of the symptom, the armed groups that delivered the final blow to a dying world. But the underlying disease, the true identity and homeland of the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, remains locked in shadow, seen only through the eyes of their most formidable enemy. To move beyond Egyptian propaganda, we must look for them in the places they finally settled, in the ashes of the cities they destroyed, and in the everyday objects they left behind. Who were they, and where did their journey begin? This is the first great mystery of the Sea Peoples, a puzzle that has consumed historians for over a century. We have their names from Egyptian inscriptions, a list of sounds that echo across the water, but no map. To find their homelands, we must become linguistic detectives and follow the trail of broken pottery. Take the name Peliset, for instance. When Ramesses III defeated them, he recorded that they were settled in strongholds along the southern coast of Canaan. Centuries later, that same coastal region was known in the Hebrew Bible as the land of the Philistines. The linguistic connection is striking, Peliset to Philistine. It suggests that at least one group of these invaders did not vanish but put down roots, eventually giving their name to the entire region, Palestine. Similarly, the name Shekelesh sounds remarkably like Sicily, and the Sardana bear a close resemblance to Sardinia. These are not definitive proofs, but they are compelling whispers, hints that some of these groups may have originated from the Western Mediterranean, from islands and coasts far from the Egyptian worldview. But words are one thing, objects are another. The most powerful physical clue comes from the very cities the Philistines, the former Peliset, later called home. At sites like Ashkelon and Ekron in modern-day Israel, archaeologists digging through the layers of destruction found something unexpected. Above the burned ruins of the Canaanite cities, a new type of pottery suddenly appears. It is not local. It is a style scholars call Mycenaean 1b, and its closest parallels are found in the crumbling palaces of Cyprus and the Greek mainland. This is not tradeware, a few fancy imported cups. This is everyday pottery, cooking pots, storage jars, and drinking bowls, the stuff of domestic life. The sudden, wholesale replacement of an entire material culture is a profound signal. It tells us that new people were here, not just passing through, but moving in with their families, their recipes, and their traditions. They brought their home with them in the clay of their pots. So, where does this evidence lead us? The prevailing theory is not of a single homeland, but of a mosaic. The Sea Peoples were likely a confederation of disparate groups from all around the fractured eastern Mediterranean. Some may have been from the Aegean Islands, displaced when the Mycenaean palaces fell. Others could have been from the coast of Anatolia, perhaps the Lucca, who were known as sailors and raiders. The Sardana and Shekelesh may indeed have begun their journeys from Sardinia and Sicily. Imagine the chain reaction. As drought and earthquake destabilized the Hittite heartland and the Greek palaces, populations were set adrift. Coastal communities, their trade networks shattered, turned their seafaring skills toward survival. They banded together not out of ethnic unity, but out of shared desperation, a floating coalition of the displaced. They were not born as a predatory horde. They were made into one by the collapsing world behind them. They moved along the coast, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, seeking a place that was not yet broken. When they found the wealthy, weakened cities of the Levant and Cyprus, they saw an opportunity, or perhaps a last resort. This transforms our understanding of their role. The Sea Peoples were not the sole cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were its ultimate symptom and its final catalyst. They were both a product of the systemic breakdown and the force that ensured it was total. They were the human wave that washed over the last crumbling walls, a desperate tide of humanity set in motion by a perfect storm of earth, sky, and failing kings. But if they were merely refugees turned raiders, how did they achieve such devastating success against empires that had stood for centuries? To answer that, we must look at their most terrifying weapon, not a sword or a ship, but a revolutionary idea. That question of identity leads directly to the next, and perhaps greatest, mystery of this entire era. Were the Sea Peoples the spark that ignited the collapse, or were they simply the most visible flame in a world already burning? This is the central historical debate, and it forces us to choose between two very different stories. The first story is the classic tale of invasion. In this view, the Sea Peoples were a primary cause, a disciplined and ruthless military juggernaut that emerged from the unknown. They were a new, external shock that the old system simply could not absorb. Proponents of this idea point to the Egyptian reliefs, which show organized naval squadrons and warriors in uniform gear. They argue that to topple so many fortified cities in such a short time, these must have been professional armies, not ragged bands of refugees. In this narrative, the great empires, while perhaps strained, were still functioning political entities. The Hittites could still sign treaties, the Mycenaeans could still dispatch fleets, the city-states could still send letters. Their end came not from a slow internal sickness, but from a sudden, violent encounter with a superior force they did not understand. The Sea Peoples, in this telling, are the archetypal barbarian horde, the destroyers of worlds. But the second story, which has gained considerable ground in recent decades, paints a far more complex and tragic picture. Here, the Sea Peoples are not the cause, but a consequence. They are a symptom of the wider collapse already underway. Think of them as climate refugees armed with swords, as prolonged drought choked the harvests from Anatolia to Greece, as earthquakes shattered the confidence of kingdoms, and as internal rebellions began to fracture societies from within, countless communities were uprooted. Skilled sailors, displaced farmers, and unemployed soldiers found themselves with no home to return to. They took to the sea and the coastal roads not as a unified conquering force, but as desperate migrants searching for stability. Their attacks were not the first blow, but the final one, landing on civilizations that were already on their knees from ecological and social disaster. In this view, they are less an invading army and more a wave of human desperation, pushed forward by the very same forces that were crumbling the palaces behind them. So which is it? The most compelling answer lies not in choosing one, but in seeing how these stories intertwine. Could they have been both? Many scholars now propose a fascinating and plausible hybrid scenario. Imagine that at the start of the crisis, many of these seafaring groups from places like Sardinia, Sicily, and the Aegean did not arrive as enemies. They may have initially served as mercenaries within the very empires that would later fall. The Hittite or Egyptian armies, always in need of skilled fighters, might have hired bands of Shardana or Lucca warriors. These mercenaries would have learned the military weaknesses of their employers, gained knowledge of treasure houses and supply routes, and formed networks with other hired soldiers. Then, when the central authority began to fail, when pay and food supplies dried up, these mercenary bands were perfectly positioned to turn from protectors into predators. They could have joined with the streams of refugees, using their insider knowledge and military skill to lead attacks on the weakened states they once served. This transforms them from a mysterious external evil into a tragic product of the system's own failure. It challenges the simplistic us versus them narrative of civilized empires versus barbarian invaders. Instead, it places the sea people squarely within the broader ecological and social catastrophe. They were not outside destroyers, but participants caught in a downward spiral whose actions accelerated the end. They were simultaneously a consequence of the collapse and the catalyst that made it total. This complexity does not make them less formidable, but it makes their story far more human and, in a way, far more familiar. It asks us to consider what happens when the structures of civilization buckle and how quickly the line between defender, refugee, and raider can blur. This brings us to a final haunting mystery. Were the sea peoples a unified army or a tide of chaos? The Egyptian carvings show a grand spectacle of coordinated conflict, with fleets clashing in formation and pharaohs defeating a singular, monstrous enemy. This image suggests a planned invasion, a confederation with a shared goal of conquest. Yet, the reality on the ground may have been far messier and far more tragic. Consider the evidence. The Egyptians list multiple distinct groups: the Peliset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, each with its own name and likely its own origin. They did not sweep across the region under a single king or banner. Instead, archaeological sites show destruction layers that are not uniform. Some cities were burned to the ground, others were abandoned peacefully, and some show signs of a slow decline with a final, violent end. This patchwork pattern does not point to a single, sweeping military campaign. It looks more like a series of crises, each with its own local story. So how do we reconcile the Egyptian depiction of epic battles with this scattered archaeological record? One powerful explanation is the domino effect. Imagine the first kingdom to fall, perhaps a minor state in Anatolia, buckling under drought and social unrest. Its population flees, becoming refugees. That displaced group, desperate for food and shelter, moves into the territory of a neighboring kingdom, which is itself weakened. A clash occurs, the second kingdom falters, and its people now join the flow of migrants, creating a larger, more desperate mass. This human wave grows with each collapse it causes, gaining momentum not from a shared strategy, but from shared desperation. It was a chain reaction of survival. The coordinated attacks the Egyptians witnessed from their fortified borders may not have been coordinated at all in the way we think. They may have simply been the cumulative front edge of this rolling humanitarian disaster, where different groups arrived at the same rich target, Egypt, around the same time because all other options had been exhausted. They were less an alliance and more a crowd funneled by geography and circumstance toward the last remaining source of stability. This view transforms them from a mysterious conquering horde into something profoundly human. A multitude of communities, each with its own language and leaders, pushed together by catastrophe, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but all moving in the same direction away from a dying world. Their unity was not planned, it was forced upon them by the collapsing landscape behind. This interpretation does not make their impact any less devastating, but it shifts our understanding of their intent. Their goal was likely not the annihilation of civilization, but the desperate, violent pursuit of a new place within it. They were not architects of the end, but its most visible and formidable passengers. And in that grim journey, they may have carried with them the very tool that made the old world's recovery impossible, sealing the fate of the Bronze Age for centuries to come. The most convincing evidence of these invaders is not carved in stone, but buried in the earth in layers of ash and shattered pottery. To move beyond the pharaoh's propaganda, we must visit the places they actually attacked and, in some cases, decided to call home. The ruins of the great merchant city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast offer a heartbreaking snapshot of that final moment. Here, archaeologists found more than just collapsed walls. In a kiln preserved by the very fire that consumed the city was a clay tablet. It was the last letter ever sent by the king of Ugarit, a desperate reply to a plea for help from the king of Elashia on Cyprus. The king writes that the enemy's ships are already here, that his own troops and chariots are deployed to the Hittite lands, and that Ugarit is defenseless. He ends with a chilling line: "Now your ships are back, but the enemy's ships are at sea. They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country." This is not a monument to glory. It is a raw, administrative record of a system in its death throes. The enemy had a navy, they struck the coast, and the mutual defense treaties between kingdoms had utterly broken down. This single-baked tablet confirms the core of the Egyptian story, but from the victim's terrified perspective. Further south, along the coast of Canaan, the archaeological story becomes even more fascinating and complex. Around 1150 before the Common Era, a series of cities were destroyed, often by intense fire. But in their place, at sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, something new emerged. A distinct and foreign material culture appears abruptly in the archaeological layers. This is the controversial Philistine Settlement, and many scholars believe it is the tangible footprint of the Peliset group from the Egyptian records finally putting down roots. The clues are in the details of everyday life. Most striking is the pottery. The local Canaanite styles of simple, hand-made vessels vanish, replaced by a sophisticated, wheel-made pottery decorated with bold geometric designs and stylized birds. This new style is not an evolution, it is a replacement, and its closest parallels are found in the Mycenaean world of the Aegean and on Cyprus. These were not trade goods, they were the cooking pots, storage jars, and drinking bowls of a new population bringing their domestic traditions with them. The evidence goes beyond clay. Analysis of animal bones at these sites shows a sudden and dramatic increase in pork consumption, a dietary habit that set them apart from their Canaanite and later Israelite neighbors, who largely avoided pig. Their architecture changed too, with the introduction of hearths in the middle of main rooms, a common feature in Aegean homes but not in Canaanite ones. Even the loom weights, the small clay pieces used in weaving, changed shape to a type common in the Aegean. This is a holistic cultural package, a signature in the soil. It strongly suggests that the Peliset did not just conquer and rule over the local population, but that they arrived in substantial numbers with their families, their animals, and their way of life, and built a new society atop the ruins. They became the Philistines of biblical fame, giving their name to the region of Palestine, a lasting legacy of their settlement. Yet archaeology is a science of interpretation, and this evidence is wonderfully ambiguous. This cultural shift does not necessarily mean a violent, wholesale replacement of people. In some sites, we see a blending of traditions over time, with local pottery styles eventually reappearing alongside the foreign ones. This could indicate intermarriage, cultural exchange, or a slow assimilation. Were the Philistines a ruling elite who adopted some local customs, or were they a mass migration that gradually integrated? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The destruction layers are real, but the settlement that followed speaks of permanence, not just pillage. The Sea Peoples, or at least the group known as the Peliset, appear to have transitioned from feared invaders on Egyptian reliefs to established neighbors in the Levant, their mysterious origins slowly fading into a new, settled identity. This tangible footprint in the dirt finally gives a face, however blurred, to the names from the pharaoh's inscriptions. But if they could build new homes, what prevented the old empires from ever rising again? The answer may lie in something they took with them, something far more valuable than gold: the search for the Sea People's homeland has always been a journey across a map of whispers. But one modern theory offers a startlingly concrete possibility, tying a name from an Egyptian inscription directly to an island of stone giants. Among the list of peoples Ramesses III recorded is the Shekelesh. For decades, that name floated in historical limbo. Then, linguists noticed its striking resemblance to Sicily, the great island off the coast of Italy. Could the Shekelesh have been Sicilians? This tantalizing clue led researchers to look at Sicily's neighbor, the rugged, mountainous island of Sardinia. And there, they found a civilization that seems to step right out of the shadows of this mystery. This is the Lost Homeland Hypothesis, and it centers on the remarkable Nuragic people. From around 1800 to the late second millennium before the Common Era, Sardinia was not a backwater. It was home to a unique and sophisticated culture that left behind one of the most distinctive archaeological landscapes in the world, the Nuragic. These are massive, conical stone towers often built in complexes that dot the Sardinian countryside by the thousands. They were not primitive huts, but complex structures that likely served as fortified settlements, watchtowers, and centers of community life. The scale of their construction speaks of a society with considerable organization, resources, and skill. But the most compelling link to our story isn't just in their architecture, it's in their art. At the Sacred Well of Monte Proma, archaeologists made a breathtaking discovery: dozens of large stone statues, some over 2 meters tall, that had been deliberately broken and buried in antiquity. These statues, dating to a period just before the Bronze Age collapse, depict archers, boxers, and warriors. Most striking are the figures interpreted as warriors. They carry a circular shield on their back and wear a horned helmet, a type of armor that bears a fascinating resemblance to depictions of Shardana warriors in Egyptian reliefs. The Shardana are another group named by the Egyptians, often shown with horned helmets and round shields, and their name itself echoes Sardinia. The coincidence is staggering. Could these statues be a representation of the very warriors who would later sail to the east and enter history as the Shardana? The theory gains further weight from evidence of travel. On Sardinia, archaeologists have found fragments of pottery from Cyprus and from the Mycenaean Greek world. This proves that the Nuragic civilization was not isolated. It was connected to the very trade networks that linked the great Bronze Age powers. Sardinia had resources, especially copper and lead, that would have been valuable in that interconnected economy. So we have a sophisticated island culture in contact with the Eastern Mediterranean, with artistic depictions of warriors that match Egyptian descriptions. What could have set them in motion? This is where the theory weaves a larger Pan-Mediterranean story. Imagine the chain reaction of collapse beginning in the Aegean. As the Mycenaean palaces fell into chaos, their trade routes shattered and their populations scattered. Some of those displaced peoples, skilled sailors and warriors, may have sailed not east toward Egypt, but west, seeking new opportunities. They could have arrived in places like Sardinia and Sicily, bringing their pottery styles and perhaps their desperation. Their arrival might have disrupted the stable Nuragic society, triggering competition for resources or even conflict. This upheaval could have, in turn, pushed some of the local populations, including skilled Nuragic warriors, back out to sea. Now armed with a grimmer purpose and perhaps allied with the very Aegean refugees who had arrived on their shores, these groups could have formed part of the Confederation that eventually turned toward the rich but vulnerable coasts of the Eastern Mediterranean. They were not a localized threat emerging from a single point, but a pan-Mediterranean phenomenon, a human whirlpool created by the collapse at its center, drawing in peoples from its farthest edges. This Sardinian connection transforms the sea peoples from a phantom army into a tangible, though still mysterious, historical actor. It suggests that the collapse did not have one epicenter but many, and that its shockwaves traveled in complex, circular patterns across the sea. The search for their origins becomes a map of the entire ancient world, every island and coast a potential piece of the puzzle. And if we can trace the journey of one group, it forces us to ask an even more profound question about their legacy. What happened to the world they left in their wake? This brings us to a more subtle, yet perhaps more devastating dimension of their power. Beyond the burning cities and the clashing fleets, the sea peoples may have mastered a different kind of warfare, one that targeted not just walls but wealth itself. The glittering world of the late Bronze Age was not held together by treaties alone. It was bound by a vast and intricate web of commerce, a kind of ancient globalization. Ships laden with copper from Cyprus and tin from as far away as Afghanistan sailed between ports, their cargo essential for making bronze, the very material of civilization. Ivory from Africa, fine pottery from Greece, glass from Egypt, and precious oils moved along these maritime highways, filling royal treasuries and signaling status. The entire system, from the pharaoh's court to the Mycenaean warlord, depended on this steady, predictable flow of goods. It was the lifeblood of the palatial economies. Now picture the map from the perspective of a merchant captain. The safe ports, the established routes, the knowledge of which kingdoms could guarantee protection. All of this was the invisible infrastructure of their age. What would happen if that safety vanished? The sea peoples, whether by design or by the chaotic nature of their movement, became the perfect storm that shattered this infrastructure. They did not need to conquer every kingdom to bring it down. They simply needed to make the seas ungovernable. A coastal trading hub like Ugarit was not just a city, it was a vital node in this network. When its last king wrote that enemy ships were already in his harbor, he was describing more than a military siege. He was reporting the seizure of a critical economic junction. With Ugarit's fleet destroyed and its port blockaded, the trade route between Anatolia, Cyprus, and Egypt was severed. The same fate likely befell the ports of Cyprus, a crucial way station and source of copper. One by one, the safe harbors went dark. For the great empires, this economic strangulation may have been a death blow as final as any lost battle. Imagine the Hittite king, his armies still mustered, suddenly unable to acquire the tin needed to forge new weapons. Picture a Mycenaean palace, its scribes still writing inventories, finding its warehouses empty because the ships carrying tribute and trade simply stopped arriving. The wealth that funded their armies, fed their populations, and legitimized their rule evaporated. This transforms our understanding of their impact. Were the sea peoples, at least in part, the most successful pirates in history, their attacks on coastal emporia were not merely raids for plunder, though that was certainly a motive. They were strikes against the central nervous system of an interconnected world. By disrupting these choke points, they triggered a cascade of economic failures. A king could survive a poor harvest by trading stored gold for grain from an ally. But if no ships could reach that ally, the gold was useless. The system had no backup, no alternative routes. It was magnificently efficient and therefore terrifyingly fragile. This perspective frames their violence not as mindless destruction, but as a force that exploited the deepest vulnerability of the age. They did not just defeat armies, they made the entire concept of centralized, palace-driven commerce impossible. In doing so, they may have unwittingly authored a brutal lesson in economics, that a civilization can be brought to its knees not only by the sword, but by the silent, empty sea where its trading ships once sailed. The ruins of Mycenae and Pylos present a silent, unsettling contradiction. These were the fortress kingdoms of the Mycenaean Greeks, the world of Agamemnon and Achilles immortalized by Homer. Their end was as complete as any, with grand palaces burned and their complex Linear B script lost to history. Yet when archaeologists sift through the ash of their final days, they find a puzzling absence. There are no strange new weapons, no foreign pottery styles, no clear cultural signature of an outside invader. The destruction layers look hauntingly familiar, as if the enemy used the same tools and tactics as the Mycenaeans themselves. This is the Mycenaean Paradox, and it forces a difficult question. Were these proud warriors simply victims of the same mysterious sea peoples, or is it possible they became them? Consider the last moments of the palace at Pylos. The Linear B tablets baked hard in its final fire are not love poems or epic tales. They are urgent military dispatches. They record the deployment of watchers to the coast, detailing specific numbers of men sent to guard certain stretches of shoreline. The enemy they feared was coming from the sea. This aligns perfectly with the broader narrative of Sea People's raids. But who was on those ships? Another clue comes from the names the Egyptians recorded. One group among the Sea People's Confederation was called the Denyen. Linguists have long noted that this name bears a striking resemblance to the Danaoi, one of the names Homer uses for the Greeks in the Iliad. Could the Denyen have been displaced Mycenaeans? It is a theory that turns the story inward, suggesting a bitter civil war that spilled out across the Mediterranean. Imagine a scenario where the intricate web of rival Mycenaean kingdoms, already strained by drought and failing trade, finally snapped. A conflict between powerful centers like Mycenae, Thebes, and Pylos escalates beyond a simple border dispute. Palaces are burned, populations are uprooted, and entire armies find themselves without a king or a home. For a warrior nobility whose entire identity was built on martial skill and seafaring, what options remain? The sea, always a highway for trade, becomes a highway for survival. These displaced bands, perhaps a mix of soldiers, their families, and skilled sailors, would have possessed intimate knowledge of coastal defenses and the very palace economies they once served. They were not foreign barbarians, they were the system's own elite, now turned against it. A group like the Denyen could have begun as a Mycenaean faction, fleeing a lost war, only to join the growing confederation of the desperate, their name forever recorded in Egypt as just another tribe of destroyers. This internal collapse theory explains the clean archaeological record. If the enemy was your own cousin from the next kingdom over, speaking your language and using your weapons, they would leave no distinctive foreign trace in the rubble. The destruction would look exactly like what we find, a Mycenaean city sacked by Mycenaean means. The real tragedy, then, is not a mysterious external force, but a catastrophic failure from within. The very competition and fragmentation that defined the Mycenaean world may have been its ultimate undoing, shattering it into 1,000 pieces, some of which then sailed away to become part of the legend of the Sea Peoples. This transforms the collapse from an invasion into a fractal breakdown, where the distinction between victim and perpetrator blurs into a single, swirling storm of conflict and flight. If the destroyers could rise from within the heart of a civilization, it makes the fall of the Bronze Age not just a historical event, but a deeply human cautionary tale about the fragility of any complex society when its own internal bonds begin to fray. While the Mycenaean world may have turned its violence inward, the fate of its great rival to the east presents a different kind of silence. The Hittite Empire was the ultimate land power of its age, a sprawling realm of mountains and plateaus centered in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Its capital, Hattusa, was a marvel of engineering and defense, a city of monumental stone gates, vast granaries, and temples to 1,000 gods, protected by walls that seemed to grow from the bedrock itself. This was not a coastal trading post vulnerable to pirate raids. It was a fortress of an empire built on treaties, chariot armies, and control of the earliest iron technologies. Yet its end was not a loud, recorded clash like Egypt's battles, but a quiet, almost complete erasure. The mystery of the Hittites is not how they fought, but how they simply ceased to be. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, Hattusa did not fall after a long, storied siege. It was consumed by a great fire and then, most tellingly, deliberately abandoned. The population left, and no one moved back in for over 3 centuries. This was not conquest, it was evacuation. The royal line vanished. Their intricate archives of cuneiform tablets, diplomatic correspondence, legal codes, religious texts were left buried in the ashes, a library of empire forgotten until modern archaeologists unearthed it. The silence from Hattusa is deafening. We have no Hittite version of the last letters from Ugarit, no final proclamations of a pharaoh. Their story of the end is told only by the empty spaces they left behind and the frantic messages from their collapsing allies. To understand this silent demise, we must look beyond the capital's mighty walls to the fragile web that sustained it. The Hittite Empire was colossal, but it was also landlocked and resource-poor in one critical area, copper. The bronze for their tools, weapons, and ceremonial goods depended on a steady supply of Cypriot copper, shipped to ports on the Syrian coast, like Ugarit, which were Hittite vassal states. This trade route was the empire's economic lifeline. Now, recall the desperate letter from the king of Ugarit, stating his troops and ships were away in Hittite lands, leaving his own city defenseless against seaborne attackers. This single document may hold the key to the Hittite collapse. The empire's military was stretched thin, trying to protect its heartland, perhaps from internal unrest or drought-induced famine, while its vital coastal supply lines were being severed. The domino effect becomes clear. As seaborne groups, the very chaos we call the Sea Peoples, began attacking and destabilizing the ports of Cyprus and the Levant. The flow of copper to the Hittite interior would have slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely. Imagine the scenario in Hattusa, the workshops falling silent, the armories unable to repair weapons, the elite unable to commission new ceremonial goods. The economic shock would have been immense. At the same time, climate data suggests severe, prolonged droughts were crippling Anatolian agriculture. The Hittite granaries, though vast, were not infinite. An empire facing simultaneous food shortages and the collapse of its critical import network would have begun to fracture from within. Local governors in distant provinces, cut off from central authority and receiving no support, would have stopped sending taxes and troops. Communities would have turned inward, hoarding what little food they had. The social contract that bound the empire together, the promise of security and distribution in exchange for loyalty, dissolved. The great king in Hattusa may have found himself ruling a hollow shell, his capital still standing but his connections to the wider world severed. In this light, the burning and abandonment of Hattusa looks less like a military defeat and more like a strategic retreat, or perhaps a final act of a government that had simply run out of options. The population may have dispersed to smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements, returning to a simpler, localized way of life. The Hittite collapse is a powerful lesson in systemic vulnerability. It underscores that even a mighty, inland superpower was not safe from a crisis born on the distant seas. Their empire did not need to be overrun by foreign warriors. It could be strangled by the disruption of a single, crucial trade route. Their silent end proves that the late Bronze Age collapse was not merely a coastal phenomenon, but a total network failure. The shockwaves from the maritime crisis traveled down the roads and rivers deep into the continental interior, proving that in an interconnected world, no fortress, however mighty, is truly an island. Amidst the smoldering ruins of empires, one civilization managed to hold the line. Egypt's survival stands as the great exception in the story of the Bronze Age collapse, a fascinating case study in resilience against an overwhelming tide. While the Hittites vanished and the Mycenaean palaces fell silent, the land of the pharaohs endured, but its victory was a desperate, costly affair that reshaped its destiny forever. The man credited with this defense was Ramesses III, and his strategy reveals a kingdom that understood the threat and adapted with remarkable speed. His memorial temple at Medinet Habu is not just a boast, it is a military blueprint. The reliefs show that Ramesses did not wait for the invaders to reach the heart of Egypt. He understood that to let them establish a foothold would be fatal. Instead, he moved his forces to meet them at the empire's edges, orchestrating a two-front defense that leveraged Egypt's greatest natural advantage, the geography of the Nile Delta. He first engaged the enemy at sea in the marshy, labyrinthine channels of the delta's coastline. This was a brilliant tactical choice. The Egyptian navy, likely using smaller, more maneuverable vessels, could fight in familiar waters, while the larger, deep-sea ships of the invaders would have been disadvantaged in the confined estuaries. The reliefs depict a chaotic naval melee, with Egyptian archers raining arrows down on enemy decks and soldiers using grappling hooks to board opposing ships. By fighting here, Ramesses prevented a direct amphibious assault on Egypt's agricultural and population centers. Following this, he confronted the land arm of the invasion, the coalition moving with ox carts and families along the coast. He fortified the eastern approaches, stationing troops and chariots to meet them in the desert fringes. This strategy of active, layered defense, using the Nile as both a moat and a highway for his own troops, was a masterclass in ancient military logistics. Yet brilliant generalship alone does not explain Egypt's survival. The foundation of its resilience was far older than any pharaoh. It was the Nile River itself. While other kingdoms relied on unpredictable rains, Egypt's agriculture was renewed each year by the river's reliable flood. This created a buffer against the regional droughts that crippled the Hittite and Mycenaean food supplies. Egypt could, to a significant degree, feed itself even when the wider world was starving. This agricultural self-sufficiency meant social stability, preventing the kind of famine-driven revolts that fractured other societies from within. Furthermore, Egypt was protected by a formidable natural fortress. To the east and west lay vast, impassable deserts, while the Mediterranean Sea to the north and cataracts to the south created defined, defensible borders. Invaders could only approach by a few predictable routes, like the coastal road from Canaan or by sea, allowing Egypt to concentrate its defenses. This isolated geography, which had sometimes kept Egypt culturally distinct, now proved to be its salvation. The empire was not just a political entity, it was a fertile strip of land insulated by a sea of sand. However, to call this a true victory is to misunderstand the aftermath. Surviving the storm is not the same as escaping it. The cost of Ramesses' successful defense was staggering. The campaign drained the royal treasury, consuming the wealth accumulated over centuries of trade and tribute. The pharaoh's government, in order to pay and supply the army, likely had to demand more from its people and its temples, straining the very social fabric it sought to protect. In the decades that followed, central authority began to wane. The priesthood of Ammon grew immensely powerful, and tomb robbers became brazen, signs of a state losing its grip. The vibrant internationalism of the late Bronze Age was over. Egypt turned inward, its foreign influence diminished, its economy contracted. The new kingdom gave way to a period of division and weakness. So Egypt's story is not one of triumphant escape, but of managed decline. It survived the cataclysm that erased its peers, but it emerged into a poorer, lonelier, and darker age. Its resilience shows that natural advantages and decisive leadership can avert total collapse, but it also proves that even the survivor can be permanently scarred by the trauma of a world unraveling. The story of the Peliset offers perhaps the clearest resolution to the mystery of the Sea Peoples, not in their origins but in their destination. This group, named in the inscriptions of Ramesses III, did not vanish after their battles with Egypt. Instead, they were settled, either by force or by choice, along the southern coast of Canaan. There, they underwent a remarkable transformation, evolving from feared invaders into the neighbors we know from a different ancient text, the Hebrew Bible as the Philistines. Their journey from a name on a pharaoh's wall to a settled people reveals a profound truth about the aftermath of collapse. The initial archaeological footprint of their arrival is stark and unmistakable. At sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, a distinct cultural layer appears atop the ruins of earlier Canaanite cities. The most telling evidence is in the pottery. Suddenly, the local styles of simple, handmade vessels are replaced by sophisticated, wheel-made ceramics decorated with bold red and black geometric patterns, spirals, and stylized birds. This pottery, classified by archaeologists as Mycenaean Eik 1b, is not a luxury import. It is the everyday wear of a new population, its closest parallels found in the crumbling Aegean world and on Cyprus. It is as if an entire domestic culture was unpacked onto this foreign shore. The clues extend beyond the kitchen. Studies of animal bones from these early Philistine settlements show a dramatic spike in pig consumption, a dietary habit that set them apart from their Canaanite and later Israelite neighbors. The architecture shifts with the introduction of central hearths in main rooms, a common feature in Aegean homes. Even the small, mundane clay loom weights used for weaving change to a distinctive shape common in the West. This complete package speaks of a substantial migration, of families arriving with their traditions intact, seeking to rebuild a familiar world amidst the ashes of the old. Yet this clear foreign signature does not last. Over the course of several generations, something fascinating happens. The bold Aegean-style pottery begins to change. The elaborate designs simplify, and local Canaanite ceramic forms and techniques start to reappear alongside them. Inscriptions, though rare, show that by the 10th century before the Common Era, the Philistines were no longer using any form of Aegean script, but had adopted the local Canaanite alphabet, the precursor to Hebrew. Their gods, once perhaps similar to those of the Mycenaeans, began to bear Canaanite names like Dagon and Baal-zebub. This is not a story of a culture being erased, but of one slowly blending, adapting, and integrating with its new environment. What does this cultural transformation tell us? It fundamentally complicates the simple destroyer narrative. The Peliset, and by extension other Sea Peoples groups, were not merely an agent of chaos. After the violent, migratory phase of the collapse, they demonstrated a powerful capacity for settlement and state building. They established a confederation of 5 major cities, the Philistine Pentapolis, which became a formidable political and military force in the region for centuries. They were innovators, introducing new ironworking technologies and architectural styles. Their story is one of resilience and reinvention. They arrived as outsiders, shaped by the collapse of one world, and proceeded to build a new one, eventually weaving themselves into the very cultural fabric of the Levant. This evolution is immortalized in the most famous encounter from the Bible, the showdown between the Philistine champion Goliath and the Israelite shepherd David. That story, passed down for generations, frames them as the archetypal enemy. Yet archaeology reveals a richer truth. The Philistines were not eternal, monstrous others. They were former migrants, then neighbors, then rivals, and finally, a people whose distinct identity gradually faded through centuries of conflict, trade, and intermarriage. Their legacy, embedded in the very name Palestine, is a permanent reminder that history's most feared invaders often become, in time, simply another thread in the tapestry of human civilization. This pattern of collapse was not unique to the Mediterranean world. While the Sea Peoples were delivering the final blows to the Hittites and Mycenaeans, other great civilizations across the globe were experiencing their own profound crises, as if the entire planet was entering a period of profound instability. In the fertile valleys of the Yellow River, the mighty Shang dynasty of China, a civilization of astounding bronze mastery and early writing, was entering its final century. Around the same time, the last king of Ugarit sent his desperate plea. the Shang state was grappling with internal power struggles, environmental stress, and pressure from neighboring groups. It would finally fall to the Zhou dynasty around 1046 before the Common Era, marking a dramatic political and cultural shift. Even earlier, centuries before the Sea Peoples set sail, the great Indus Valley civilization, with its meticulously planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, had already faded into silence. Its script remains undeciphered, and its decline, while not fully understood, is often linked to shifts in river patterns and a changing climate. These events were not directly connected by trade or conflict, they were separated by vast continents. Yet their rough chronological alignment is a clue that cannot be ignored. It points to a possibility that the troubles of the Late Bronze Age were part of a wider pattern. A growing body of scientific evidence, from ice cores to ancient tree rings, suggests a period of significant global climate fluctuation around 1200 before the Common Era, often called the 3.2 Kiloyear Event. This was not necessarily a single catastrophe, but a prolonged phase of cooler, drier conditions in many parts of the world. For early complex societies that had pushed their agricultural systems to the limit to support growing populations and elite palaces, this climatic shift could have been the trigger for a cascade of failures. Drought would lead to famine, famine to social unrest, unrest to migration and conflict. The interconnected Mediterranean world, with its dense web of trade and diplomacy, simply transmitted this shock with devastating speed and efficiency, making its collapse particularly dramatic and total. In this light, the story of the Sea Peoples transforms. They are no longer a bizarre, isolated mystery, but the Mediterranean expression of a recurring historical theme. They represent the human dimension of a global moment of vulnerability, when early civilizations, having reached a peak of complexity and interconnection, discovered just how fragile that achievement could be. Their ships were not the cause of the storm, but the most visible debris caught in its current. This broader view asks us to consider a haunting question, not about who they were, but about the nature of civilization itself. The ground beneath their feet was turning to dust. While the images of clashing ships and burning cities capture our attention, a quieter, more relentless enemy was at work across the entire region, one that may have set the stage for everything that followed. Modern science is now revealing that the world of the Late Bronze Age did not just face a few bad harvests, it endured a climatic catastrophe that lasted for centuries. This is the climate change hypothesis, and it transforms our understanding of the collapse from a military mystery into an ecological tragedy. Deep within caves across the eastern Mediterranean, in the silent, steady drip of water, a record of ancient weather is locked in stone. Stalagmites, those upward-growing formations, act as natural archives. By analyzing the chemical signatures in their layers, scientists can read the rainfall patterns of millennia past. What they find for the period beginning around 1200 before the Common Era is a stark and prolonged shift toward intense aridity. The same story is written in the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes and in the fossilized pollen preserved in sediment cores. The pollen of drought-resistant plants like sagebrush increases dramatically, while the pollen from trees like oaks and pines, which need reliable moisture, plummets. This data paints an undeniable picture of a mega-drought, a period of severe dryness that may have lasted for generations, peaking during the very century the great empires fell. Imagine the slow, creeping crisis this created. A kingdom can survive a lost battle, but it cannot survive consecutive years of failed harvests. The entire economic and social foundation of these palatial societies was agricultural surplus. Grain was wealth. It paid soldiers, fed scribes, and supported the artisans who created luxury goods for trade. As the rains failed year after year, the granaries that symbolized royal power began to empty. Famine would have spread not as a sudden event, but as a grinding, pervasive hardship that eroded society from the ground up. When the central authority could no longer distribute food, the bond between the ruler and the ruled shattered. Why remain loyal to a distant king or an unhearing god when your family is hungry? This environmental stress likely triggered waves of internal migration as farmers abandoned their parched fields and moved toward the coasts or major river valleys in search of sustenance. These displaced populations, hungry and desperate, would have put immense pressure on the very urban centers and trade networks that were also struggling. In this light, the movement we call the Sea Peoples takes on a new and tragic dimension. They may not have begun their journey as a coordinated army of conquest. They might have started as communities of climate refugees, their homelands rendered uninhabitable by drought, packing their families and possessions onto ships and carts in a desperate search for a place that could still support life. Their attacks on coastal cities were perhaps less about plunder for wealth and more about seizing the means of survival: food, water, and land. They were the human face of a planetary shift, a desperate migration that crashed against civilizations already weakened by the same climatic forces. This perspective does not excuse violence, but it provides a profound context for it. The great battles recorded by Ramesses III were not merely clashes between order and chaos. They were the tragic, violent intersections of multiple groups of people, all fighting for dwindling resources in a world that was literally drying up around them. The collapse becomes less a story of mysterious invaders and more a sobering lesson in how environmental change can unravel the complex fabric of human civilization, pushing societies to the brink and forcing populations into motion with devastating consequences. It asks us to see the Sea Peoples not as a cause, but as a symptom of a much deeper, global sickness. But the most profound change may not have been in who fought, but in what they fought with. The very name of the era, the Late Bronze Age, reveals the material foundation of its power. Bronze was the wonder metal of the ancient world, strong enough for weapons and beautiful enough for statues. Yet its creation relied on a fragile alchemy, an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was available from places like Cyprus, but tin was extraordinarily rare, sourced from only a few distant mines in places like Afghanistan, Cornwall, and Central Europe. The entire glittering edifice of chariot armies, elite weaponry, and palatial wealth depended on a long, vulnerable supply chain stretching across continents. When the collapse began, those chains were the first to snap. As ports burned and kingdoms fell into chaos, the steady flow of tin simply stopped. For the remaining warriors and emerging powers, this presented an existential crisis. How do you arm a soldier when you can no longer make bronze? The answer was already being forged in the hills of Anatolia and the Levant, a technology that would define the next millennium: iron. Iron ore is vastly more common than tin deposits. It is literally dirt cheap, found in bogs and surface deposits across much of the world. The knowledge of working it had existed for centuries, but iron is notoriously difficult to smelt and shape compared to bronze. It requires much higher temperatures and skilled smithing to become useful steel. For the centralized palace economies, it was easier and more prestigious to control the import of exotic tin and produce luxurious bronze. The collapse changed that calculus entirely. With the bronze trade network in ruins, necessity became the mother of invention. The old, top-down control of metal production was over. Now, any local chieftain or community with access to a bloomery, a simple clay furnace, and a skilled smith could produce weapons and tools. This technological shift was revolutionary. It democratized military power. You no longer needed to be a king with connections to distant mines to equip an army. A band of determined fighters could source their own materials and forge their own swords. This leads us directly to the Sea Peoples. Could their devastating success be partly explained by an early embrace of this new technology? The evidence is tantalizing but thin. A few iron objects have been found in contexts associated with the Philistine settlements. and some Egyptian reliefs seem to show enemies carrying swords of a different, possibly iron, color. Yet no trove of iron weapons has been definitively linked to them. It is more likely they were beneficiaries of the broader technological transition that their own actions accelerated. By shattering the bronze-based system, they helped create the conditions where iron could rise. The shift from bronze to iron is more than a footnote in material science. It is a powerful symbol of the entire collapse. The Bronze Age was defined by complexity, centralization, and exclusivity. Its metal was the product of a global network controlled by elites. The Iron Age, born from the ashes, was defined by accessibility, decentralization, and resilience. Its metal was local and eventually superior. The old order, with its palatial monopolies, could not survive in this new landscape. The collapse did not just change who held power, it changed the very substance of power itself, moving it from the hands of a few kings to the forges of many villages. In the fragmented world that emerged, the ability to make your own iron was the key to sovereignty. The silence that followed the collapse was deep and long-lasting. For roughly 400 years, from around 1100 to 750 before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a period scholars now call a Dark Age. The term is not a judgment of culture, but a description of the historical record which grows dim and fragmented. The great lights of civilization had gone out. The intricate scripts that once recorded royal decrees and grain shipments, Linear B in Greece and cuneiform across the Near East, fell into disuse and were forgotten. Without the palace bureaucracies that employed scribes, there was no need for such complex writing. The art of literacy itself retreated to a few isolated pockets, a skill nearly lost. The vibrant hum of international commerce fell to a whisper. The ships that once carried copper, tin, and ivory across the seas no longer sailed the established routes. Populations declined, with many people abandoning the vulnerable plains and coastlines for smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements. It was a world turned inward, simpler, poorer, and far more local. Yet within this apparent regression, the seeds of a new world were quietly taking root. The collapse of the massive, centralized palace economies forced a profound social reorganization. Power could no longer be concentrated in the hands of a single distant king. Instead, smaller, more decentralized communities emerged. These were often based on kinship ties or warrior bands, led by local chieftains rather than god-like pharaohs. This shift, while born of hardship, fostered a different kind of resilience. These communities had to be more self-sufficient, more adaptable. They were not burdened by the immense overhead of a royal court, and their smaller scale made them less vulnerable to a single point of failure. From this fragmented landscape, crucial innovations began to spread. One of the most transformative was the alphabet. In the Levant, the coastal Canaanites, known to history as the Phoenicians, building upon earlier scripts, perfected a revolutionary system of writing. Unlike the hundreds of complex syllables in cuneiform or Linear B, their alphabet used a small set of symbols to represent consonant sounds. It was simple, efficient, and easy to learn. This was not a tool designed for palace accountants, but for merchants tracking shipments. The Phoenician alphabet would travel across the Mediterranean, adapted by the Greeks to include vowel sounds, eventually giving rise to the writing system we use today. Its very creation was a product of a new, more pragmatic and commercial age. This brutal reset, therefore, was not a permanent end. It was a necessary, if traumatic, period of simplification. The old, top-heavy systems had grown too rigid and too interdependent to survive the shocks of a changing world. Their collapse cleared the ground, literally and figuratively. It broke the monopoly of bronze and paved the way for ubiquitous iron. It dissolved old political hierarchies, making space for new forms of governance. Out of the small, fortified villages of the Greek Dark Ages would eventually grow the independent city-states, the polis, like Athens and Sparta, whose experiments in citizenship, philosophy, and politics would shape the classical world. In the Near East, new imperial powers like Assyria would rise, learning from the past and building their empires on different, more militaristic and administrative foundations. The cycle is one of creative destruction. The great superpowers of the late Bronze Age had to fall for the Classical Age to be born. Their disappearance created a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed new peoples, new ideas, and new technologies. The story of the Sea Peoples and the collapse they symbolize is ultimately a story about the fragility of complex systems and the relentless, often painful, capacity for human reinvention. It asks us to consider what must sometimes be broken apart so that something new and perhaps more resilient can finally begin. Their story echoes across 3,000 years with an unsettling familiarity. We live in a second globalized age, a world woven together by digital threads and container ships, where a drought in one continent can spike bread prices in another, and a blockage in a single canal can halt the flow of global commerce. Our interconnectedness is our greatest strength, and also, as the Bronze Age reminds us, our greatest vulnerability. The ancient trade routes that carried tin and copper have been replaced by intricate supply chains for semiconductors and rare earth minerals. The royal messengers on horseback are now instantaneous data packets flashing across undersea cables. We have rebuilt a system of astonishing complexity and efficiency, but like the palace economies of old, it possesses a deep and systemic fragility. A single point of failure, whether a pandemic that silences factories, a cyber attack that cripples a financial network, or a climate event that disrupts agriculture across multiple breadbaskets, can trigger a cascade of consequences we struggle to predict. The Sea Peoples did not invent the droughts or the social tensions that weakened the great kingdoms, but their movement was the catalyst that turned a crisis into a cataclysm, exploiting the brittle connections between states. Today, we must ask ourselves what our modern catalysts might be, and whether our networks are robust enough to withstand them. Resilience, it seems, is not about building higher walls, but about creating systems that can bend without breaking. The ancient world had no backup, no redundancy. When Ugarit fell, that trade link was severed forever. Our lesson is to build flexibility into the very fabric of our global society, to foster local capacity alongside global exchange, and to remember that sometimes the most advanced system is the one that can also function when its most sophisticated parts fail. The silent centuries that followed the collapse were not merely a dark age. They were a necessary simplification, a return to fundamentals from which new ideas could eventually grow. Perhaps the ultimate wisdom from those shadowy invaders and the world they helped end is this: progress is not a straight line upward, but a cycle of building, testing, and sometimes rebuilding from the ground up. For over a century, the clues have been fragments of pottery and faded inscriptions, but the mystery may finally be yielding to the silent testimony of bone and tooth. The search for the Sea Peoples is entering a revolutionary new phase, powered by scientific tools that read the stories written in the human body itself. This is not a reinterpretation of old texts, but a biological investigation, and it promises answers that could settle debates that have lingered for generations. One of the most powerful new methods comes from the study of ancient deoxyribonucleic acid. By extracting genetic material from skeletal remains found in the destruction layers of cities like Ashkelon or from the early Philistine cemeteries, scientists can now ask direct questions about ancestry. Did the people buried in these new cultural layers possess genetic signatures distinct from the local Canaanite population? Preliminary studies from Ashkelon have revealed a fascinating signal. Genetic material from individuals dating to the early Iron Age, the period of Philistine settlement, shows a discernible influx of southern European ancestry, specifically linked to the Aegean region. This genetic component was not present in the earlier Bronze Age inhabitants of the city, and it gradually diluted over subsequent centuries as the population mixed with locals. This is not just a hint, it is a biological confirmation that new people arrived from across the sea at precisely the time the historical records describe. Another remarkable technique acts as a geologic passport etched into childhood. Strontium isotope analysis examines the chemical composition of tooth enamel, which forms in our early years and locks in the signature of the local geology where we grew up. By comparing the strontium isotopes in a tooth from a skeleton found in a Philistine city to the isotopic maps of the Mediterranean, researchers can potentially pinpoint where that individual spent their childhood. Was it the limestone hills of Greece, the volcanic soils of Sardinia, or the coastal plains of Canaan? This method can trace individual journeys, moving us beyond broad cultural groups to the stories of single lives uprooted by the chaos of collapse. Alongside these biological tools, our understanding of the environmental backdrop has grown exponentially. Paleoclimatology, the study of past climates, has moved from broad theories to high-resolution models. By analyzing layers in lakebed cores, cave stalagmites, and marine sediments with incredible precision, scientists can now reconstruct rainfall and temperature patterns year by year, sometimes even season by season, for the period of the collapse. This data is transforming the climate change hypothesis from a plausible idea into a detailed chronicle of disaster, showing us the exact timing and severity of the droughts that likely pushed societies to the breaking point. These tools collectively represent a paradigm shift. We are no longer solely interpreting what these people made, like their distinct pottery, or what others wrote about them, like the pharaoh's carvings. We are now beginning to analyze who they were, where they came from, and what world they endured. The next decade of archaeology holds the potential to replace the label sea peoples with specific names and routes, to map their migrations not with arrows on a map, but with the chemical trails left in their teeth and the genetic echoes in their bones. The shadows that have hidden these invaders for 3,000 years are finally beginning to lift, illuminated by the quiet, objective light of modern science. Yet the story told by ruins and relics is not a single, agreed-upon narrative. It is a vibrant and sometimes heated conversation among those who piece the past together. If we could gather the leading scholars of this era in one room, we would witness not a unified verdict, but a fascinating debate over ultimate causes, a clash of interpretations that keeps the mystery alive. One prominent voice in this discussion belongs to historian Eric H. Klein. After decades of study, he champions the idea of a perfect storm. He argues that no single catastrophe could have felled such resilient empires. Instead, he envisions a convergence of disasters, each amplifying the others. Earthquakes shattered cities, a prolonged drought crippled agriculture, internal rebellions fractured social order, and the disruption of international trade starved the economies. In this view, the Sea Peoples were not the initial spark, but the final, devastating element in this chain reaction. They were the opportunistic flame that swept through a forest already weakened by disease, drought, and storm. Klein's multi-causal model is compelling because it mirrors the complexity of the modern world, where crises rarely arrive alone. But other scholars listen to the paleoclimate data and hear a different, more dominant story. For them, the mega-drought is not just one factor among many, it is the primary engine of collapse. They point to the stark evidence from stalagmites and sediment cores, a climatic shift so severe and prolonged that it would have made the eastern Mediterranean fundamentally uninhabitable for its large, centralized populations. In this interpretation, the Sea Peoples become a direct consequence, not a separate cause. They were climate refugees on a colossal scale, entire populations displaced by failing harvests, pushed into motion by the changing sky. The battles and invasions were the tragic, violent symptom of a planetary fever. This perspective shifts the focus from human agency to environmental forces, asking us to see these events as a stark lesson in ecological vulnerability. A third camp of thought gives far greater weight and organization to the invaders themselves. While not denying climate or other stresses, these historians and archaeologists look at the Egyptian reliefs and the coordinated destruction of coastal cities and see a deliberate, transformative military force. They argue that the Sea Peoples possessed a level of naval technology and coordinated strategy that the old kingdoms could not counter. Perhaps they were not desperate refugees, but a new kind of polity, a mobile, maritime coalition that actively sought to dismantle the old order to build their own. In this reading, they are the primary actors, the architects of a new age forged through conquest. Their impact so profound precisely because they targeted the interconnected nodes of the Bronze Age world with precision. Meanwhile, some archaeologists digging at the sites of the fallen empires focus their attention inward. At places like Mycenae and Hattusa, they see less evidence of a foreign enemy and more signs of internal fracture. The burning of administrative buildings and storehouses suggests popular uprising, a revolt against the palace elites who had failed their people. The collapse from this vantage point was a social revolution, a rejection of a top-heavy, exploitative system. The Sea Peoples in this scenario might have been a secondary phenomenon, perhaps even mercenaries formerly employed by the collapsing states who turned on their employers when the system broke down. Here, the true destroyers were not mysterious outsiders, but the simmering tensions within the civilizations themselves. This scholarly debate is not a sign of confusion, but of healthy, rigorous inquiry. It illustrates that history is not a list of settled facts, but an ongoing dialogue with the past. Each perspective shines a light on a different facet of the catastrophe: the environmental, the military, the economic, the social. The enduring mystery of the Sea Peoples lies precisely at the intersection of these views. Were they the product, the weapon, or the catalyst? The answer we lean toward says as much about how we view our own complex, interconnected world as it does about the ancient one. It challenges us to consider what we believe is truly capable of bringing a golden age to an end. Their mysterious legacy did not end with the fall of Hattusa or the rise of the Philistines. It found a second life in the art and stories of our own time, transforming from a historical puzzle into a powerful cultural symbol. Long before modern archaeology began sifting through the ash layers, the Sea Peoples were being resurrected on canvas. In the 19th century, during the Romantic era, artists captivated by themes of grandeur and ruin painted spectacular scenes of ancient cataclysm. They depicted hordes of fierce, barely clothed warriors swarming the coasts of Egypt or Greece, often under brooding, dramatic skies. These paintings were not concerned with historical accuracy, they were emotional spectacles. The Sea Peoples served as the perfect embodiment of the noble savage or the destructive barbarian, a chaotic force against which civilized order could dramatically define itself. This artistic tradition cemented an image in the popular mind, one of a faceless, overwhelming tide of otherness crashing against the pillars of civilization. It was a visual myth that proved incredibly durable. That myth has seamlessly migrated into the digital age, finding a vibrant new home in video games and novels. In strategy games, they appear as a unique, late-game faction that players must desperately fortify their borders against, a sudden existential threat that tests the stability of the empire you have built. In historical fiction, they are the looming shadow in the third act, the explanation for why a character's world is burning. Their appeal to storytellers is obvious. They are a historical blank slate. With no known homeland, no deciphered language, and no surviving records of their own perspective, they are essentially a narrative void. Writers and creators can fill that void with almost anything. They can be displaced climate refugees, ruthless pirate leagues, survivors of a lost advanced civilization, or even something more fantastical. This flexibility makes them a versatile tool for exploring deep themes. Most often, they are used to represent the ultimate other, an external threat so alien and overwhelming that it forces societies to confront their own fragility. They are the perfect metaphor for apocalyptic change, for the fear that everything we have built can be swept away by forces we do not understand. This reflects a profound and enduring human fascination, the anxiety that our own complex, interconnected world might be just as vulnerable as the Bronze Age palaces. Every generation seems to project its own contemporary fears onto these shadowy invaders. In eras worried about mass migration, they become unstoppable waves of displaced peoples. During times of economic or environmental anxiety, they transform into the inevitable consequence of societal overreach and ecological neglect. In speculative fiction, they sometimes evolve into allegories for pandemics or cyber collapse. The Sea Peoples, precisely because they are so poorly defined by history, become a mirror. We see in their mysterious movements a reflection of our own deepest uncertainties about stability and progress. Their story endures not merely because it is an unsolved mystery, but because it speaks to a timeless question: what does it take for a world to end, and what emerges from the silence that follows? The silence of the Sea Peoples is perhaps their most defining feature. We have the boastful carvings of their enemies, the ash of the cities they burned, and the distinct pottery of the homes they built. Yet the core of their identity remains a locked box, and the keys are questions that historians still argue over in quiet libraries and at dusty dig sites. The first and greatest of these is the search for a homeland. Where is the smoking gun? We have compelling clues, like the artistic links between Sardinian statues and Egyptian reliefs, or the linguistic echoes tying the Shekelesh to Sicily. But a clue is not proof. For a definitive homeland, archaeologists dream of finding a site, perhaps on the coast of Anatolia or an Aegean island, that shows clear signs of a sudden, mass departure right before the collapse, a place abandoned in haste with material culture that perfectly matches what appears in Philistine cities. We have not found that place. The evidence is frustratingly circular. We identify them by their presence in the Levant, then try to trace that presence back to an origin point that remains just out of reach. This absence forces us to consider a disturbing possibility. What if they had no single homeland at all? What if they were always a composite, a floating coalition of the displaced that only coalesced into a named threat in the eyes of the Egyptians? Without that anchor in the soil, they drift forever in historical ambiguity. Then there is the puzzle of their rapid cultural fade. In the early Philistine settlements, the foreign pottery, dietary habits, and architecture are stark and clear. Yet within a few generations, these signals begin to blur. The bold Aegean designs on their pottery give way to simpler, local styles. They adopt the Canaanite alphabet and gods. Does this mean they were always a small, elite group who ruled over a local population and gradually adopted their subjects' ways? Or does it point to a substantial migration that simply integrated with remarkable speed, their distinct identity dissolving through intermarriage and daily coexistence? The archaeological record can support both interpretations, leaving us to wonder about the true scale of their movement. Was this a story of large-scale population replacement, or was it primarily a powerful cultural idea, a new way of organizing society that spread by force and imitation? The bones themselves, through ancient deoxyribonucleic acid, are starting to whisper answers, suggesting real people arrived from distant shores. But the story written in genetics is one of mixture, not replacement, adding yet another layer of complexity to the mystery. This leads to the most haunting silence of all, the absence of their own voice. every narrative we have comes from the perspective of the civilizations they attacked or the ones that survived them. The Egyptians called them chaos. The Hebrews later saw them as formidable foes. But what did they call themselves? What stories did they tell around their hearths about the journey that brought them across the sea? Did they see themselves as desperate refugees, ambitious conquerors, or simply survivors doing what was necessary in a world coming apart? A single clay tablet written in their own hand, in their own language, would be worth more than a treasure hoard. It would transform them from a historical phantom into a people with motivations, fears, and a perspective on the collapse they are blamed for causing. The fact that no such record has been found or perhaps ever existed means we are forever seeing them through a distorted lens, their true humanity obscured by the smoke of the palaces they burned. These lingering questions are not signs of failed research, but markers of a profound historical truth. Some stories from the deep past are permanently incomplete. The Sea Peoples remind us that history is not just about the answers we find, but about the gaps that remain. They exist in the space between civilizations, in the chaos of transition, a reminder that the most pivotal moments are often the least documented. Their enduring mystery is a testament to the scale of the catastrophe they were part of, an event so disruptive it could break the chain of memory itself. And so the search continues, not just for pottery shards or genetic markers, but for a narrative that can finally make sense of the shadows. The next great discovery in a Mediterranean tomb or a submerged port could still, at any moment, change the story entirely, offering a glimpse through the eyes of the unidentified invaders themselves. So how do we assemble these shattered pieces into a story that makes sense? The collapse of the Bronze Age was not a mystery with one culprit, but a disaster with many accomplices. To understand it, we must see how each strand of crisis, environmental, social, economic, and military, twisted together into a single, unbreakable cord that strangled an era. It begins not with a sword but with the sky. For generations, a creeping drought tightened its grip on the eastern Mediterranean. Tree rings narrowed, lakes shrank, and the once reliable rains grew scarce. This was not a single bad season. It was a relentless, multi-generational drying that turned bread baskets into dust bowls. In a world where over 90% of people were farmers, this was an existential threat. Harvests failed not once but repeatedly. The great granaries of the Hittite and Mycenaean palaces, the very symbols of royal power and stability, began to empty. Famine is a quiet, slow-moving invader. It does not storm the gates with torches. It seeps into homes and hollows out communities. As hunger spread, the foundational contract between ruler and ruled began to fracture. Why pledge loyalty to a distant king or a silent god when your family is starving? The palace elites, living in their fortified complexes, appeared increasingly detached from this widespread hardship. This environmental stress ignited the second strand, social rebellion. Archaeological evidence from several sites suggests that when the final fires came, they targeted not just defensive walls, but the administrative buildings and storage facilities, the physical heart of centralized control. This points to internal uprising, a revolt against a system that could no longer provide basic security. The rigid, top-heavy hierarchies that had sustained these empires for centuries became their greatest vulnerability under pressure. A king could command an army, but he could not command the rain. As internal order frayed, the third strand, the intricate web of international trade, began to unravel. The Bronze Age global economy was a delicate mechanism. It required tin from Afghanistan to mix with Cypriot copper. It relied on Egyptian gold and Mycenaean pottery moving along protected sea lanes. This system depended entirely on political stability and safe passage. A weakened kingdom could not protect its merchant ships or its coastal emporia. Pirates, always a threat, found richer and less defended prey. More critically, as kingdoms turned inward to deal with their own crises, they stopped fulfilling trade agreements. A Mycenaean palace might have ample stored olive oil, but with no ships arriving from Cyprus with copper, that oil became useless for acquiring the essential material of the age. The economy began to seize up node by node. This was the brittle world into which the fourth strand, the movement of peoples, arrived. Groups we call the Sea Peoples were likely a product of this very same disintegration. They were not a cause appearing from nowhere, they were a consequence set in motion. Displaced by the same droughts and upheavals, communities from Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, and perhaps the Western Mediterranean took to ships and carts. They were not a unified army with a battle plan, but a collection of the displaced, some desperate for new land, others opportunistic for plunder. They moved along the coastlines, and they found not formidable empires but weakened states. Their attacks were the final catalytic shock. They did not need to conquer every inland capital. They simply needed to sever the remaining lifelines. By sacking pivotal port cities like Ugarit and destabilizing Cyprus, they delivered the coup de grace to the already faltering trade network. The Hittite Empire, starving and now cut off from its copper supplies, simply imploded. In Greece, palaces burned, their last record speaking of watchers on the coast. The sequence becomes clear. Climate stress led to social stress, which disrupted economic networks, which created a flood of desperate migrants, whose violence then collapsed the last functioning parts of the system entirely. It was a vicious, reinforcing cycle. Each failure made the next one more likely and more severe. No single factor was enough. An earthquake alone would have left the trade routes to rebuild. A drought alone might have spurred innovation or migration. A pirate raid alone would have been a temporary setback, but their convergence within a single lifetime created a perfect storm from which recovery was impossible. The superpowers of the ancient world were not defeated by a superior enemy. They were undone by their own interconnectedness in a time of cascading failure. Their greatest achievement, a cosmopolitan, globalized system, became, in the end, their single greatest point of failure. The tale of the unidentified invaders is not a closed book, but an open window. Through it, we see a world eerily familiar in its connections and chillingly instructive in its fragility. We have walked the scorched floors of Ugarit, read the final words of a king baked into clay, and stood before the stone giants of Sardinia, searching for faces in the shadows. We have listened to the pharaoh's boastful carvings and sifted through the silent ash of Hattusa, where an empire left without saying goodbye. This journey reveals that the collapse was never a simple story of barbarians at the gate. It was a symphony of failure where the notes of drought, rebellion, and broken trade combined into a crescendo of chaos. The Sea Peoples did not write the music, but they became its most forceful instrument. Their enduring mystery lies not in their obscurity, but in their complexity. They were both the product of a crumbling world and the hammer that shattered its last pillars. In their movement, we see the desperate human response to systemic collapse, a reminder that when the foundations shake, people take to the sea and history turns a page. As we look at our own intricately linked planet with its digital networks and global supply chains, the lesson whispers across the millennia. Resilience is not found in monuments or centralized wealth, but in flexibility, in redundancy, and in the humble, adaptable strength of communities. The superpowers of the Bronze Age forgot that. They built towers of clay tablets and forgot the ground beneath their feet was turning to dust. The unidentified invaders, whoever they truly were, serve as a permanent question mark in the human story, a symbol of the unforeseen forces that can emerge when a system strains to its breaking point. Their legacy is the dark age that followed, a necessary silence from which new ideas like iron and the alphabet could slowly rise. So the mystery endures not as a failure of history, but as its deepest invitation. It asks us to look beyond simple tales of heroes and villains, to see the interconnected web of cause and effect, and to understand that civilizations, however mighty, are conversations with their environment, their people, and their own limits. The echoes of their world's end are not just in ruins, but in the quiet questions we must ask about our own. This journey through the ashes of a lost world is just the beginning. The mystery of the Sea Peoples and the collapse they symbolize remains one of history's most vibrant debates, a conversation that continues in university halls and archaeological digs today. To explore further, you can dive into the work of scholars like Eric H. Klein, whose book 117 BC masterfully details the perfect storm of disasters. Or follow the cutting-edge science of paleoclimatology, which uses everything from ancient tree rings to ice cores to reconstruct the climate crisis that reshaped the ancient world. These resources offer a deeper look at the evidence and the compelling theories that try to make sense of it all. Now we turn the question to you. After following this story, where do you stand? Do you see the Sea Peoples as the primary destroyers, a ruthless military force that toppled empires? Or do you believe they were ultimately a symptom, a desperate human tide set in motion by environmental and social breakdown? Perhaps you see a different interpretation entirely. Share your perspective in the comments below and let us know what modern parallels you observe in our own interconnected age. If unraveling historical puzzles like this one captivates you, consider subscribing and tapping the notification bell. There are countless more shadows from our past waiting to be explored, from lost cities to forgotten technologies. Together, we can keep piecing together the grand, unfinished story of humanity, one fascinating mystery at a time.